Right now, the wheels are humming along the Mississippi, and the bluffs on either side are glowing that pale, chalky white. Those cliffs are the reason this whole city exists. Long before it was a capital, before the railroads and the mansions and the ice palaces, this bend in the river had a name. And the story of how a bootlegger's shanty became the capital of Minnesota is one of the strangest founding tales in all of America. Welcome back to Fru World Explorer. Let's roll through the history of St. Paul. St. Paul sits in east-central Minnesota, right where the Minnesota River spills into the Mississippi. Together with Minneapolis just upstream, it forms the Twin Cities. But make no mistake, these are two different towns with two very different personalities. St. Paul is the older of the pair, the state capital, and in a lot of ways the quirkier one. So let's start at the very beginning with the river itself. Long before any of that, the Dakota people knew this place as Imniza-ska, the White Cliffs, named for the pale sandstone the river carved through here. Just a few miles upstream lies Bedo, the meeting of the waters, where the Minnesota and Mississippi join. For the Dakota, this is ancestral homeland, a place people have gathered for thousands of years. Ride these riverside trails today, and you are moving through one of the oldest continuously meaningful landscapes in the entire upper Midwest. The first thing the United States built here was a fort. Between 1820 and 1825, the Army raised a stone fortress on the bluff above the confluence, first called Fort St. Anthony, then renamed Fort Snelling for the colonel who finished it. Its job was to guard the fur trade and plant the American flag on the northern frontier. That fort is still standing today, just downriver from where we are riding, and it pulled traders, soldiers, and settlers to this stretch of the Mississippi. Now here is where it gets fun. In 1838, a retired French-Canadian fur trader turned bootlegger named Pierre Parent set up a whiskey business near a spot called Fountain Cave, just off what is now West 7th Street. Parent had one cloudy, crooked eye, and everybody called him Pig's Eye. His little landing became the unofficial heart of the settlement. And for a while this future capital city was actually known, I am not making this up, as Pig's Eye Landing. A pig's eye. That was very nearly the name of Minnesota's capital. Then in 1841, a young French priest named Father Lucien Galtier arrived and led the settlers in building a small log chapel on the bluff, dedicating it to St. Paul. Galtier decided the growing town should carry the saint's name, not the bootleggers. As the story goes, he declared, "Pig's Eye, converted thou shalt be like Saul. Arise and be henceforth St. Paul." The new name stuck, and that little chapel gave the city its identity. Let's coast for a second here along the riverfront. It is hard to picture now, with the bike path and the parkland and the quiet, but this waterfront was once the busiest place for hundreds of miles in any direction. In those early days, everything and just about everyone arrived here by water. St. Paul grew up around its lower landing, the last easy place to unload a boat coming up the Mississippi before the rapids and St. Anthony Falls blocked the way. That made it the gateway to the whole upper Midwest. In the year 1858, more than 1,000 steamboats tied up here in a single season, hauling settlers, lumber, and supplies. If you were heading into the Minnesota frontier or the Dakota Territory, your journey very likely began right here on these docks. All that traffic made St. Paul the obvious center of power. When Minnesota Territory was organized in 1849, St. Paul was named its capital. That very same year, Senator Henry Rice and banker John Irvin gave the city its first public square, Rice Park, which is still here downtown, and which actually predates New York City's Central Park by about 7 years. When Minnesota became the 32nd state in 1858, St. Paul kept the crown as its capital. Which brings us to the building that crowns the whole city. The current Minnesota State Capitol opened in 1905, designed by a St. Paul architect named Cass Gilbert, who would go on to design the Woolworth Building in New York and the United States Supreme Court. Its gleaming dome, sheathed in white Georgia marble, is one of the largest self-supported marble domes in the world, modeled on St. Peter's Basilica in Rome. Gilbert wanted his capital to be the heart of the city, and more than a century later, it still is. Look across the city, and you will see its second great crown, the Cathedral of St. Paul, rising on Summit Hill. Archbishop John Ireland hired a French Beaux Arts architect named Emmanuel Masqueret, and this enormous domed cathedral was dedicated in 1915. It can seat around 3,000 people beneath a dome that rises more than 180 feet. Together, the Capitol and the cathedral give St. Paul one of the most dramatic skylines of any city its size in the country. Let's turn up onto Grand Avenue for a bit and change the pace. A century ago, this was a streetcar strip, and then an auto row lined with car dealers. But starting in the 1970s, shopkeepers reinvented it as a walkable district of cafes, bakeries, bookstores, and boutiques. Today it is one of the most beloved streets to stroll in the entire city. But no single person shaped St. Paul quite like this next man, James J. Hill. In 1878, he and a few partners bought a nearly bankrupt railroad, and over the next 20 years he pushed his tracks all the way to the Pacific Ocean, creating the Great Northern Railway. Remarkably, he did it without the big government land grants most railroads relied on. They called him the Empire Builder, and to this day, a passenger train still carries that name across his old route. In 1891, Hill finished his home on Summit Avenue, and what a home it is. 36,000 square feet of red sandstone, with 13 bathrooms, 22 fireplaces, a pipe organ, and a 2-story art gallery for his collection of French paintings. It was the largest house in Minnesota, and you can tour it today. Stand out front and you are looking straight at the raw scale of Gilded Age railroad money. And the Hill House is just one address on the most remarkable street in the city. Summit Avenue runs about 4.5 miles, from the Cathedral all the way down toward the river, and it is widely called the longest, best-preserved stretch of Victorian mansions in the United States. More than 370 of its original grand homes still stand, a rolling open-air museum of turrets, towers, and carved stone porches you can pedal right past. One of those Summit Avenue houses launched a literary legend. F. Scott Fitzgerald was born in St. Paul in 1896. As a struggling young writer, he moved back into his parents' row house at 599 Summit Avenue, and in the summer of 1919, up in that top-floor room, he rewrote the novel that would make him famous, This Side of Paradise. When it hit shelves the next year, it turned the 23-year-old into an overnight sensation and helped define the whole jazz age. St. Paul raised another giant of American culture, though this one worked in pen and ink. Charles Schulz, the creator of Peanuts, grew up right here. His father was a barber, and young Charles, nicknamed Sparky, devoured the comic strips in the St. Paul and Minneapolis papers. He went to Central High School, and a family dog named Spike, who could supposedly eat pins and tacks, helped inspire a certain beagle named Snoopy. Good grief, that is a lot of talent for one river town. Let's drop down toward Lilydale now, along the river. Under these very slopes lie fossil beds from a shallow sea that once covered Minnesota, some 450 million years ago. Trilobites, brachiopods, ancient sea creatures, all pressed into the shale. It is a strange and wonderful feeling, riding an e-bike over an ocean floor far older than the dinosaurs. Now up to one of St. Paul's crown jewels, Como Park. The city set this land aside all the way back in 1873. Its centerpiece is the Marjorie McNeely Conservatory, a gorgeous Victorian glass house that opened in 1915, inspired by the Great Palm House at Kew Gardens in London. Add a free zoo and a serene Japanese garden, and Como has been the city's shared backyard for 150 years. Back downtown, facing Rice Park, stands a pink granite castle called the Landmark Center. It opened in 1902 as the federal courthouse and post office. In the 1930s, when St. Paul was crawling with gangsters, members of the notorious Barker Carpy's gang were put on trial inside these very walls. Rescued from the wrecking ball in the 1970s, it is now a beautiful arts and culture center, and its turrets look like something out of a fairy tale. About those gangsters. For decades, St. Paul ran a quiet arrangement remembered as the O'Connor layover, in which criminals could lie low in the city, so long as they behaved themselves while they were here. That is how figures like John Dillinger and Ma Barker ended up in town. One of their favorite haunts, the Wabasha Street Caves, are sandstone caverns dug right into the River Bluff. In the 1930s, they held a swanky nightclub called the Castle Royal, where big bands played and the drinks flowed. You can still tour them today. For a bite in the middle of all this history, few places are more iconic than Mickey's Diner. This little red and yellow dining car was built in a New Jersey factory, shipped here by rail, and opened in 1939. It is a genuine Art Deco streamliner, just 50 feet long, and it is listed on the National Register of Historic Places. It has been serving late-night breakfasts to St. Paul for the better part of a century. And St. Paul does not hide from its brutal winters. It throws a party. Back in 1886, after an East Coast reporter sneered that the city was another Siberia, unfit for human habitation, proud residents answered with the very first St. Paul Winter Carnival. They crowned King Boreas, the ruler of winter, and built a towering palace out of ice blocks harvested from the frozen lakes. That first palace stood over 100 feet tall. The carnival still runs every winter, making it one of the oldest in the nation. Like a lot of river cities settled by German immigrants, St. Paul became a brewing town. Two great names rose over the bluffs. Theodore Hamm built his empire starting in 1865 in the Phalen Creek Valley, cooling his beer with natural spring water, and Hamm's grew into one of the largest breweries in the country. Just across town, Jacob Schmidt raised his own castle-like brewery. Their grand old buildings still watch over the neighborhoods that grew up around them. Here is one you might not expect. The company we now know as 3M, one of the biggest in the world, began in 1902 as a failed mining venture up on Lake Superior. The minerals turned out to be worthless, and the young company nearly went under trying to make sandpaper. A St. Paul investor named Lucius Ordway brought the struggling firm here in 1910, and in St. Paul it finally found its footing and grew into an inventing giant. Not bad for a business that started by digging up the wrong rock. Just across the water from downtown lies Harriet Island, a riverside park named for Harriet Bishop, the city's first schoolteacher. Its elegant stone pavilion was designed by Clarence Widgington, who in 1915 became the first African-American municipal architect in the entire country, right here in St. Paul. He designed some 90 buildings around town, including palaces for the winter carnival. This peaceful riverfront is one of the finest places anywhere to take in the skyline. So that is St. Paul, a city that grew from a bootlegger's shanty into a state capital, a place that gave the world a railroad empire, a jazz-age novelist and Snoopy, a town that answers winter with an ice palace and hides jazz clubs down in its caves. Riding these bluffs, you can feel all of it layered right under your wheels. Thank you so much for exploring it with me. If you enjoyed this ride, go ahead and hit that subscribe button and join us here on Fru World Explorer, because there is always another river, another bluff, and another story waiting just around the bend. See you on the next one.